afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Herbst, and I'm president of American Jewish University. Over the last few weeks, Israelis have debated, and many across the world have watched, significant proposals about changes in the judicial system that have caused a titanic clash, with hundreds of thousands of people protesting in the streets, and debates about whether Israel's democracy is in peril. We're delighted at American Jewish University to present today this program featuring Joel Joseph, titled Israel Debates, the Judiciary, Law of Return, and Democracy. It's a pleasure today to welcome Joel Joseph to the program. Joel is the author of 18 books on the law, including most recently, Solomonic Justice, How the Israeli Supreme Court Became a Beacon of Justice in the Middle East. Joel is best known for his book, Black Mondays, Worst Decisions of the Supreme Court, that's now in its 5th edition, and Justice Thurgood Marshall provided the foreword. Joel is a former law professor and graduate of Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. He's particularly noted for bringing the successful Hungarian gold train case against the United States. At the close of World War II, the U.S. Army seized the train heading to Germany with the property of Hungarian Jews. The case was settled with the Justice Department, and the multi-million-dollar settlement went to Hungarian Jewish survivors who were then mostly in their 80s. Joel, welcome. Pleasure to have you on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
And you'll see in Joel's background the cover of the book in English, which came out in February, and the Hebrew edition, which is going to come out in April. Joel, you wrote Solomonic Justice, published this year in February, without full knowledge that reform of the judiciary and the Supreme Court would become an issue, perhaps the central issue in Israeli politics. And you've told me off camera that you started the book 10 years ago. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, there haven't been any books on the Israeli Supreme Court, and I had been reading over the years all of the cases, and some of them are quite interesting and quite different from the U.S. Supreme Court. For example, standing is often a barrier to somebody bringing a case in the United States. You have to be injured in fact to bring a case. And in fact, that's been a big issue for the student loan case that's before the US Supreme Court. In Israel, however, almost anybody can bring a case. Nonprofits can bring a case challenging all government actions. And it's interesting because I was protested against the Vietnam War back in the 60s and 70s, and there were many cases brought, but the US Supreme Court would never hear them. In Israel, many cases are brought that challenge actions of the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, and the court has many times held that their actions are either torture in violation of the Geneva Convention, or that, for example, concerning the wall between the West Bank and Israel proper, that the wall had to be moved because of Israeli Supreme Court. That would never happen in the United States. You could never get standing to bring a case like that, nor would the court hear a case against the military in the United States.
Joe, that's a very important introduction because the sheer breadth of what the Supreme Court can rule on obviously plays in a variety of ways into the controversies that we're seeing today. Let me ask you about the title of the book. You note early on in the book, and it's a theme throughout, that the Israeli Supreme Court often gives partial victories to each side rather than the winner-take-all decisions, which are more familiar in the United States and the UK. And this goes back to famous stories, of course, about King Solomon. Can you explain what you mean by partial victories and why you think that's such a defining aspect of the court?
Well, when you have two different parties to a case, neither one is 100% right or 100% wrong. In the United States, and in a recent case, the abortion case that came up from Mississippi, the court could have given a little bit to both sides by saying that the law, the 15-week limit for abortions is constitutional, and instead overruled Roe versus Wade, which they didn't have to do. So they basically gave an all-out 100%, maybe even 200% victory to the right to life petitioners in that case. In Israel, in the most recent case that's in the book, they had it was in East Palestine, East Jerusalem, which is Palestine as well. Land was disputed when Jordan owned it. The Palestinians were given the right to it. And then when Israel invaded during the '67 war, title changed and there were disputes. So, but in the present day, they had Palestinian tenants in a building that was supposedly owned by Jewish citizens of Israel. And the Supreme Court basically gave each side a little bit. They allowed the Palestinians to stay, but didn't ultimately rule who owned the property. So the Palestinians have to pay rent, but they're allowed to stay in the property. And it was an eviction case. So in the United States, that never would have happened. They would have either evicted or ruled that the property belonged to the Palestinians.
Joel, Israel famously does not have a constitution. It's only one of 3 democracies in the world, the others being the UK and New Zealand, that don't have a constitution. So can you describe how the Supreme Court evolved into its current role?
Well, it is very complicated. Israel intended to have a constitution. They were going to have a basic law, which is in effect a constitution. And the Supreme Court over the years has decided that certain rights, free speech and so forth, were one of the basic rights. But since there is no constitution, that's why the Knesset can make changes. And that I believe poses a danger. Also, I want to point out Canada doesn't really have a constitution either, which is sort of strange, but they were created by an act of parliament.
Joel, some of the controversy in Israel has its origins in what you describe as the judicial revolution, or a mini revolution that began in the 1990s. Can you explain that? Well,
they have followed U.S. precedents quite a bit. There's an old U.S. Supreme Court case, Marbury versus Madison from 1803, that is cited by the Israeli Supreme Court. And it basically says, just like the U.S., that the Supreme Court has the final rule. And of course, there's nothing in Israeli law that says that. The court has took it upon itself to be dominant and have the last word. In the US, it is the same. The Supreme Court has the last word under Marbury versus Madison, but it is interesting how they will refer to US cases like that, landmark US cases.
How different is the Israeli Supreme Court today than, let's say, what observers would have noted in the 1950s? Well, how much has it changed?
It has evolved and changed quite a bit. The court was established in 1948 when Israel became a nation. And it always has served, and I'm quite amazed by it. Like, people have read about the Eichmann case and about the Demjanjuk case, which were 2 cases about Nazi war criminals or alleged war criminals. And the Israeli Supreme Court, when they tried Eichmann, for example, did everything they could to protect his rights, to give him counsel, and to protect his well-being too, because if you recall, he had a bulletproof glass installed because there were many people wanted to kill him because he was the architect of the so-called final solution. And so he was the biggest war criminal that there was. And the Mossad, the secret, sort of SEAL Team 6 of Israel, took him from Argentina and brought him back to Israel for a fair trial. I think it was a fairly fair trial, public trial. Very few countries would have done that. They would have killed him. I'm sure the Nazis would have killed, an enemy like that. And even the U.S. didn't bring Osama bin Laden back to the United States for trial. We killed him. We assassinated him. And Jem Janjuk, the case is even more interesting because the Israeli Supreme Court freed him. They said that it wasn't, his guilt wasn't proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Very few nations would have done anything like that for an alleged war criminal. So the court emerged over the years, but it has always been sympathetic, or at least give rights to the defendants, to Palestinians, to the Ethiopian Jews. The government of Israel did not want to give the Ethiopian Jews equal protection, and the Israeli Supreme Court gave them full protection of citizens and had the right of return as American Jews or Jews from any place in the world. So any racist tendencies that were in Israel were overcome by the Israeli Supreme Court. So the court, of course, evolved over the last 75 years, but it always had, I think, a very good sense of justice.
Now let's talk about the current controversies. It might be a surprise to some that judicial reform was such an important part of the coalition that emerged victorious, led by Benjamin Netanyahu. Most people, most of the time, think about the economy, and of course, in Israel, security is always a critical issue. But why has judicial reform been a driving force in this right-wing government, with the prime minister seeming to be willing to spend an enormous amount of political capital on particular controversial reforms that we'll discuss in a few minutes? But first, maybe you could explain to the audience why this has become such an important issue.
Well, I believe, and I think all the protesters believe, that an independent judiciary is an important part of a true democracy. And, in the United States it is, in Great Britain it is, in every advanced democracy, the courts have the last word. And one reason that the Netanyahu government is fighting it is that they don't want to be overruled by the court. And many people say that Netanyahu himself is afraid because he's in the middle of a trial himself. And the Knesset did pass today a law that said that he basically gets a pass right now. I think the trial's suspended while he's in office. So they are chipping away at the power of the Israeli Supreme Court. And the other one the Knesset passed recently was to change the judicial selection process.
Let's go through, I'll group them, some of the current proposals and your reaction. Maybe most significant, certainly the easiest for outsiders to understand, is the proposal that it makes it at once significantly harder for the Supreme Court to overturn laws made by elected leaders, and allows a majority, 61 out of 120 members of the Knesset, the power to overturn Supreme Court decisions. How radical a departure is that from the status quo?
It's a tremendous departure from the status quo. And I've been surprised at how many segments of the Israeli society have objected to it, including they had a group of Air Force pilots who said they won't defend a country that's not a true democracy, and a true democracy has to have an independent judiciary. So you have military. I don't think you get the military in the United States to join a protest like that. You have obviously the opposition leaders, you have hundreds of thousands of people are protesting against it. So it's broader. It's a broad coalition that's objecting and trying to seek an independent judiciary to uphold the rule of law. A lot of in the business community in Israel, the high-tech industry, which in Israel is one of the most successful industries there, they're protesting, and I think they're having an effect. The government has sort of put a pause on the reform for a while, anyway, for a couple months, and I think the momentum is building in favor of preserving most of the power of the Israeli Supreme Court.
It gets complicated, and we'll try to explicate it. And I know the audience will appreciate your views. And we'll talk for about 10 or 15 more minutes, and then welcome questions from you, the audience. So please start submitting your questions. President Herzog has weighed in a fairly dramatic way. It seems that many people in Israel agree that there should be judicial reform. And this has been a topic for some time. They either don't like the current reforms or don't like the way the current reforms are being pushed. So how do you understand President Herzog's take on the Knesset's relationship to the Supreme Court?
Well, I think he's trying to serve as a mediator, trying to create peace. I don't know him personally, obviously, but from afar, it seems like he's trying to get some common ground. I think he's allowed, as I said, the judicial panel to be modified slightly, which doesn't really hurt the character of the court that much. Time will tell, though, what happens. I think the pressure is on from all the different segments that I mentioned, that from the military, from business leaders. Business leaders want the rule of law to stay the way it is.
Prime Minister has said, and members of his coalition have said, that they won, that they ran on this. They achieved victory, not quite a majority of votes, but a clear majority as Israeli politics go in the Knesset, and bridle about the accusations about a democratically elected government implementing non-democratic reforms. So how do you understand the paradox of a democratically elected government, which had a margin that was more significant than recent Israeli governments, being accused, and I think you've joined those accusations, of a non-democratic character?
Well, I think part of the problem goes to how we started, that they don't have a constitution. The constitution in this country, puts constraints on the legislature, and the Israeli Knesset doesn't really have the kind of restraints that we have. It doesn't have a constitution. So this is sort of a free fire battle. I do wish that Israel had a constitution, and maybe this will bring it to a head that there should be. But at this point, it's probably difficult to negotiate a founding document like that.
One of the things that I think is difficult for Americans to understand is the Supreme Court can act on a reasonableness standard as grounds to reverse or prevent government actions. Recently prevented a minister from being appointed. The proposed reforms would remove the reasonableness or extreme unreasonableness as grounds to reverse a government action. Can you explain that?
It's difficult to explain. I mean, reasonableness is in your mind, and anytime a Supreme Court, any place in the world, sets a standard like that, you don't know how it's going to be interpreted. So it is exceptionally hard to explain. It's sort of a wiggly term. You don't know when a decision is reasonable or not, or an appointment is reasonable or not. So that leaves too much discretion probably in the court's hands.
And is that discretion at the heart of some of these problems that, the court, especially given its proclivity, as you said, to give partial victories, seems to engineer quite a bit?
It's definitely, the court has free range. I mean, the US Supreme Court has free range too. They interpret the Constitution the way they want to, and they're the final word. That's part of the nature of the beast of Supreme Courts.
Another aspect of the reforms is how justices are appointed. This is always an important issue, maybe especially important in Israel, because while justices have life tenure, there's a mandatory retirement age at 70. So there's a much greater change in the number of justices that go through the Supreme Court than in the United States, where justices can stay on as long as they want, pretty much. So can you explain what the current proposal is to change the nature of how justices are appointed?
In Israel, as opposed to the United States, the Prime Minister of Israel is limited in who he can appoint to the court. It's limited by a committee, and the committee right now has 9 members, and the proposed reform, which I think just passed this section, goes up to 11. And the Supreme Court itself has 2 members on the committee. The Knesset has, I believe, 2 members. The administration has certain members, and they want to change that and increase it. It has, I think, led to a high quality of jurists on the Supreme Court, because the Bar Association also has, I believe, 3 members on the committee. So in the United States, of course, the American Bar Association makes recommendations, but they don't have the power that the Judicial Committee does in Israel. So I think it's worked pretty well to have high quality. I've read hundreds of Supreme Court opinions, and they are exceptionally well drafted. And the members, both conservative and liberal and moderates on the court, are of the highest quality. And that same committee does make recommendations for the lower courts in Israel. In the United States, it's much more political, as you know. The president basically picks who he wants, and the Senate and the Senate Judiciary Committee grill that candidate, and they often lie to the committee about what they're going to do. The last 3 justices said they believe in stare decisis, which means that they believe in precedents like Roe versus Wade, and then they turn around and overturn it. Let me go to the age thing. The proposal is to change the age, the mandatory retirement age, from 70 to 67, which would give the prime minister and the government even more appointments to make.
Because more people would have to retire quicker.
Yes. And I think quite a few members of the court are in that age range.
So let's discuss the politics behind this. Some people say that the current dispute really originated, there's always been a dispute about the judiciary, but the current dispute and the current conflict can be traced back to the Gaza disengagement in 2005, almost 18 years ago. And that was traumatic. Thousands of Israelis were removed from Gaza, bodies were exhumed from their graves. But in the aftermath, there were jail terms for relatively minor infractions of protests, attempts to try protest leaders for sedition, arrest of nonviolent protesters, including the administrative detention of teenagers, and preventing those teenagers from taking matriculation exams when in prison. And the right says, where was the Supreme Court during all of that? And Herzog, in his big speech in February, did reference that. Do you sense that this is in fact traced back partially to Gaza? And how do you evaluate the right's claim that that was also a traumatic decision taken by a slim government majority with a heavy-handed response, but they were not protected?
Well, I think it's a very good point. The Gaza situation is mentioned by many of those seeking reform, and the Israeli Supreme Court is not infallible, and I think that's one indication that yeah, it's not perfect. They're humans. It's made up of humans, and I do have a chapter in the book on blunders by the Supreme Court. But overall, I think the Israeli Supreme Court is one of the best in the world. The criticisms are valid. The Israeli Supreme Court did approve the removal from Gaza, the giving Gaza back to the Palestinian residents. It's a tough situation.
Michael Oren, Ambassador Michael Oren, friend of this university and has appeared on this program several times, wrote an article in The Atlantic where he said, beyond the importance of the debate about the current proposals, what's going on here is a debate about different conceptions of Israel. One, he said, of people, this is an exaggeration, but it's a quote, want Israel to be like France, and another who has a more Talmudic, let's say, set of ambitions for Israel and wants Israel to be uniquely Jewish. Do you sense that, or do you sense that this is a more tactical political debate around the issues you referenced at the beginning of the program?
I think that is one of a valid issue. The court is very secular. They have ruled against Orthodox Jews in some ways, but they have protected the rights of Palestinians, of Muslims, of the Jews from Ethiopia. So they're a much more secular institution than in some other places. I don't know if I'd say it's more like France, but it's unique. It's definitely unique, but it's definitely a secular institution. And I can see how the Orthodox would not be happy with it.
Let's go to the questions from the audience. As I said, we already have 19 questions. Please keep them coming. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Joel, you're very popular and very provocative. One member of the audience asked, how might the current proposals play out in terms of changing the civil rights of Israeli citizens?
Well, the court has been very protective of civil rights. In fact, they go way beyond the United States on civil rights. One case that Justice Rivlin wrote is very instructive. In the United States, if you're involved in an automobile accident and you're injured, the amount of money that you make is taken into consideration. In Israel, Justice Rivlin ruled that no, you can't look to that. You have to compensate humans the same way. Mm-hmm. So protecting the rights of the poor is something that has been done by the Israeli Supreme Court. The reforms probably will make the court a little bit more conservative, but I have confidence that the court will stay protective of civil rights.
There have been, as a follow-up to the audience's questions, there have been particular concerns about the rights of women, LGBTQ plus communities. Do you share those concerns?
Well, I share those concerns. I think the court, I can't predict what the court would do with, transsexual rights or something like that, because that issue hasn't come up, as far as I know. I have confidence in the court that it's constructed now, and I don't think the reforms will change it that much.
Another question from the audience: does the Supreme Court ever reference the Torah as legal guidance in its rulings? And why don't we expand that question to ask, how does it manage its precedents? It cites other countries and it cites Jewish learning. How does it manage all of that?
It does. I've seen references to the Torah mentioned. The Torah was, I guess I could say, basic law to some of the jurists. it's difficult, but they refer to, and the court cases go through because Israel was part of the Turkish Empire, it's part of the British Empire. So those laws are applied in some cases where a landowner bought land when it was Turkish. Some of those rights are still in effect. If they bought a piece of property when it was under the British Empire, some of those laws are still in effect. So it's very complicated. And the court juggles them all, juggles all the rights. As I said, they don't do a winner take all. So they try to give something to both parties.
Another question for the audience, very interesting. One audience member writes, one of the institutional problems of the Israeli Supreme Court is that members of the court are appointed by a small group of lawyers, and they can refuse to accept those who differ ideologically and politically from the current membership. Compared to the United States, of course, where the president and the Senate appoint, and where the appointments can vary as the electoral fortunes of different parties wax and wane. So the audience member asks, is there any prospect for a change in the manner of appointment to the Israeli Supreme Court so that the judges over time would become more diverse?
Well, I think the change to the Judicial Committee will make it a little bit more conservative when there's a conservative government. If the Labor Party comes back into power, things will change. But I think things can move slightly to the right over the next couple appointments.
Another member of the audience writes, are there, absenting ourselves from the current controversies, and you're looking at a judicial body which you've studied for a long time now, do you think there are particular reforms that are necessary?
No, I don't. I think, as I said, I think this court has done an incredible job. It's very difficult to protect the rights of Palestinians and other minorities, but they've done so. And they're in a tough situation, but they've done a great job. I don't think reforms are necessary.
You referenced this before, but another member of the audience writes, how much of this is really about Bibi Netanyahu's own particular situation at the moment, as opposed to bigger issues around judicial independence?
Well, it's just my gut feeling that a lot of it is about the prime minister and his personal battles with the court. I think he's Trump-like in that if a court rules against him, there's, he's got to have some kind of retribution. So I don't know him personally, but that's the feeling I get.
Another member of the audience wanted to go back to the reasonableness standard, which is something very hard for people to understand, that laws can be overturned, or government actions indeed can be prevented or overruled on the basis of reasonableness. Where did that originate from?
I can't really answer that. I'm not sure.
But even though it gives the justices a fair amount of discretion, you're pretty sanguine about how it's operated over time. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. I think the court really does have a good sense of justice, which, as I also said, it's not perfect, but it's doing a good job.
One of the vexing issues, and another member of the audience references this, in Israel, pretty much since the creation of the state, has been who is a Jew, and therefore who is recognized as Jewish by the state. How do you see the current reforms playing into that set of controversies?
Well, there's a case in the book about that, and the Orthodox in Israel wanted to be the ones who decided who is a Jew, but the court went beyond that, and that plays into the Ethiopian Jews, because the Orthodox Jews didn't want to consider them Jews, but the Supreme Court ruled that they are. So as the religious parties get more power and more power to possibly be on the judicial committee, I think that can shift. I hope it doesn't. I think it's important to have, diversity in Israel, and just hope it doesn't change.
The audience references this, and I'll take up a Wall Street Journal editorial, which you probably saw a few weeks ago, which argued that Netanyahu's reforms were not anti-democratic because it returned Israel to around 1995. So is this set of reforms returning, as the proponents say, to the status quo ante before the judicial revolution, which you write about at great length in the book? Or is this something more dramatic and foreboding?
I think it's more dramatic than that. I think it's going back way before the 1990s. And I think it's anti-democratic. I think the court should remain independent. And certainly if you had a 2/3 requirement or a 3/4 requirement in the Knesset, it might make a little more sense. But to allow the Knesset to overrule the Supreme Court by one vote on a major issue of civil rights, or whether the military complied with the Geneva Convention, the one vote threshold is just too low.
This was going to be controversial. Everyone knew that, and judicial reform has been an issue, and Oren writes about this in his Atlantic Monthly article, has been an issue for decades for a lot of people. Are you surprised, though, at the way it's evolved with these mass demonstrations in the streets of hundreds of thousands of people in a country that, after all, doesn't have that large a population?
I'm very surprised. I'm very proud of the Israeli people for standing up like that. I'm very impressed that they're knowledgeable on these issues of civil rights and the rule of law, and it's a good surprise.
The Netanyahu coalition says this is about trying to reverse the electoral results. But that they wanted the ballot box, and now people are trying to win in the streets. What would you say to that?
Well, I don't think the election was, about the court. It might have been one issue, but it wasn't the main thrust of the campaign. But not only that, it's anti-democratic, as I said before, to have the court overruled by just a slim majority.
Very interesting question from a member of the audience, and please keep those questions coming. We now have over 30. Who asks about the Arab citizens of Israel who are seemingly on the sidelines, who have their own problems, in many cases, with Israeli institutions, but at the same time may be affected negatively, I think you've intimated, by the reforms. How do you evaluate their position?
Well, I think they're a very important part of Israeli society. One of the other justices that I've communicated with was an Arab Israeli who was a justice. It's pretty interesting that there was, I wasn't aware of it, 20 years ago, that they had Arab Israeli justices on the court. I think it's important that they be recognized, that their rights be protected, and that all citizens in Israel have the right to practice their religion as they see fit.
Another member of the audience asks, how much of this issue, the judicial reform, the current controversies, is really about the Haredi population wanting military exemption from service in the IDF? And something you write about some in the book.
Well, I think it's part of it. The Orthodox Jews want to be treated differently, and the Supreme Court of Israel has treated them equally to other sections of society. I think that definitely plays a part in the demand for judicial reform. I hate to call it judicial reform. It really isn't reform at all. Judicial tinkering, judicial abuse, something like that, not judicial reform.
Okay, Joel, let me put you on the spot. How do you think this is all going to work out?
I think they'll make some changes, like to the committee. I don't think they're going to pass the big change of allowing the Knesset to overrule by one vote. But I may be wrong. That's just my prediction.
And that's based on just reading the tea leaves, or do you see something else at work?
Now, reading the tea leaves, but the thing that really convinced me is when they had a group in the Israeli Air Force who said they wouldn't fight for a country, they wouldn't go on a mission for a country that they didn't feel was democratic, and that a true democracy has an independent court, Supreme Court. That to me was the tipping point. Also, the high-tech leaders who have a lot of support in Israel and a very important component of the economy, they're all in favor of not having any reform at all.
Okay. Joel, obviously we could talk about this for a long time to come. I'm sure no matter what happens, that judicial reform will continue to be an issue in Israel. Been delighted to talk with you. Congratulations on the book, Solomonic Justice, which came out in February in English, will come out in April in Hebrew and Israel. Maybe you could tell the audience in the last few moments that we have about your new project.
I'm working on a book totally different called Plastic Pollution Solution. I believe that plastic in our water, in our air, is an existential threat to humans. And that's my cause right now, and probably the cause for the rest of my life, trying to get pollution reduced. I just sent the uncorrected galleys off to Congressman Jamie Raskin, who's working with me on legislation that ties into the book.
Joel, extraordinary range, and the other 18 books have an extraordinary range of legal topics. Thank you so much for joining with us today.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.